The next topic we're going to address is consumer surplus. Okay, and much like producer surplus, which was connected to cost and marginal cost, consumer surplus is very much connected to the concepts of benefit and subsequently marginal benefit. Okay. Now, what makes this a little easier than the concept of marginal cost is the fact that we've already defined the dynamics of marginal benefit. And way back in previous videos, we said that marginal benefit tends to decrease the more we consume of a product, which makes sense. I get a lot of a benefit out of the consumption of my first candy bar, but if I consume a second one, I still may get benefit from it, but it's probably not as much as the first. And if I consume a third one, I'm probably getting less benefit out of that third one than I did the second one, which was less than I got out of the first one, etc., etc. So if I were to graph marginal benefit, okay, it would be downward sloping over Q. Now, again, the way we view this is that at some quantity, what would I be willing to pay for that last unit? So at some quantity Q prime, what would I be willing to pay for that Q primed unit? Well, I'd be willing to pay the marginal benefit for it, which is equal to that distance there. Okay, and therefore that would be the price I would be willing to pay for that Q primed unit. Okay, so marginal benefit conceptually says that, well, what would I be willing to pay for whatever unit I desire to consume? Okay, now why is this dynamic interesting? Because we had the identical dynamic with demand, only it was viewing demand from the price axis. Okay, in demand, when we were outlining the law of demand, we said, okay, at a price of P prime, how much would we be willing to purchase of the product? Now it would be Q prime units. Marginal benefit says, how much would I be willing to pay for the Q primed unit? Well, it would be equal to the benefit I get from that unit, or P prime. In other words, just like supply and marginal cost were equivalent concepts, marginal benefit and demand are also equivalent concepts. Okay? Now, what is consumer surplus then? Okay, well, if we imagine that at every unit I get a certain level of benefit off each unit. In other words, at the first unit, the amount of benefit I get from it is equal to the distance from the horizontal axis up to the marginal benefit curve. The amount of benefit I get from the second unit is equal to the distance of the horizontal axis up to the marginal benefit curve, etc., all the way down to the Q primed unit. Then it makes sense that the total benefit I get from the consumption of all Q prime units must be equal to the sum of the marginal benefits. In other words, this area here is my total benefit from the consumption of Q prime units. Okay? The problem is that I have to give the cashier money for Q prime units. And how much money do I give the cashier? It's equal to that box right there. Okay? In other words, P prime times Q prime is the amount of money I owe the cashier. Now that money is gone once I give that to her, and I can't do anything else with it. In other words, some of my total benefit from the consumption of Q prime units is neutralized to some extent, or offset, if you will, by the fact that I have to give the cashier some money. But the amount of total benefit is greater than the amount of benefit that was offset by me giving money to the cashier. And how much is it greater? It's greater by this amount here. Okay. In other words, that part of total benefit is my consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is simply the excess benefit from the consumption of a good above what I actually had to pay to purchase that product. No, it's the excess benefit from the consumption of a good over and above what I actually had to pay for that product. That's what consumer surplus is. Now, like producer surplus, consumer surplus is obviously bounded by certain things. And that's what I'm gonna do now. So what are the boundedness? And again, just like producer surplus, I'm doing this. I'm mapping out these boundedness conditions because once this graph gets far more complicated than it currently is, it's going to become harder and harder to tell what's consumer and producer surplus. So these boundedness conditions become very useful. So boundedness conditions is consumer surplus is bounded above, okay, by demand, okay, and we know demand is equivalent to marginal benefit. It is bounded below by the price that the consumer has to pay for the product, okay, the effective price the consumer has to pay for the product, and it's bounded on the right by the quantity traded. Okay, in other words, how much the consumer consumes of the product. Okay, so these are the boundedness conditions for consumer surplus.